Good morning. Get ready because our speaker today is someone who spends his days outsmarting the pests that like to outsmart us. Josiah Ritchey, Master's in Science of Entomology, is Senior Vector Entomologist at the Rentokil-Terminix North American Innovation Center in Dallas. He leads the charge on new, science-driven strategies for some of our toughest medically significant pests: mosquitoes, ticks, bedbugs, flies, and of course, wasps. Today's given us a quick tour through wasp control strategies in the residential world and unveiling some cutting edge innovations that attract, capture, and knock down yellow jackets before they ruin anyone's weekend. Welcome to our computer screens, Josiah.
Thank you all very much for having me. I'm excited to talk about a pest group that historically wasn't something I looked into until coming to Rentokil, but has been a lot of fun. I'm really excited to be here. And thank you very much for the invitation. And I just want to make sure everyone can see my slides good and coming through loud and clear. Hopefully, if not, shout out or type in the chat box. And just to comment briefly a little bit more on what Jason mentioned, the pest vertical, as we call it, that I work on primarily is vector pests. My priority is working with mosquitoes and ticks. However, our lab tends to capture more than just those groups of organisms, those groups of insects. We grab really anything that can bite or sting you. And so that's how we end up working with flies, bed bugs, and yellow jackets. And just a little bit more primer about myself and where I work. I don't know if any of y'all are familiar with the Innovation Center that's been open for, it'll be 2 years this coming June in 2026. But essentially, we're a large organization, obviously, through the Rentokil-Terminix merger. And they built this innovation center in 2024 to help us promote the development of new, not just products and technologies for pest management, but also focusing on how we can improve the actual service aspect, because obviously that's really what we're here to do. The science is a huge part of it, but also we need to consider when we're trying to improve operations, we need to think about the service side of things. Previously, I worked for the Davy Tree Company as a plant healthcare technician, but that really was their version of what you would consider to be a traditional pest management technician. So I feel very valuable to have had that experience. But what's cool about this innovation center as well is that we're actually sharing this large facility with 5 branches that operate in the DFW area. And so it allows myself, as well as the other scientists on our team, and there's about 8 or 9 of us in total, to interact with service managers as well as technicians, at least on a weekly basis, if not on a daily basis. And we get to get out in the field a lot to at least try to help solve some of the problems that our residential and commercial field operations teams are dealing with. Obviously, today we're here to talk about wasps and some new innovations that are in the works for yellow jackets in particular. And I just want to put this outline out here. I'm going to be talking a lot today. And so I just wanted to give everybody a little bit of orientation as to where we're going and what we're trying to achieve. First, really, there's 4 points, maybe 5 points I'm talking about, but they're really grouped into 3 main sections. First, I'm going to talk about a pretty obvious question that you're probably all aware of as to why wasps matter in pest management. And then I'm going to transition to a brief primer, which may be review for a lot of you on some basics of identification and biology of wasps, how to identify them based on what they look like as a specimen, but then also talking about some of their nesting habits. Then I'm going to transition into talking about the importance of safety and PPE for this particular pest group. Obviously, these considerations are important in pest management generally, but certainly when you're dealing with something that can bite or sting you, they potentially become even more important. And with that as well, I'm going to talk about how what we do for wasps and bees more generally, how it relates to non-interventional IPM strategies that don't actually involve insecticides. And then really the meat of the talk, or the second half of the talk, is going to focus on briefly some of the tried and true strategies for yellow jackets, paper wasps, and hornets specifically. And then the last section we're going to talk about is kind of where the most evolution or innovation for yellow jackets in particular is taking place, the development of trapping and baiting strategies for yellow jackets. And I have two quiz questions peppered throughout this talk, and there'll be slides, so no worry about missing them. But what I thought we would do as well is in those after those quizzes, if you have questions throughout the chunk of material I just covered, please feel free to put it in the chat box. And I have that open on my second screen, so I can look in there and maybe address some questions throughout the talk rather than just hedging them all at the end. However, I certainly look forward to hopefully a good discussion at the end of the talk if you have any questions that don't come up through the talk. So before we get into more specifically the yellow jackets, the wasps and paper wasps and the hornets, I just wanted to give everybody a very brief primer on what is really the only order of insects that are capable of stinging, and that's this order, Hymenoptera. It's really a diverse group, as I hope this phylogenetic tree shows you, and it encompasses insects outside of what we traditionally think of as stinging pests. You can see in this order, we also have the ants, which are very closely related to wasps and bees. But then we also have some non-stinging insects, such as these cuckoo wasps, which are a really charismatic group. You've probably seen them if you've been outside at all in the summertime, really anywhere in North America. And I typically, if I do this talk or something like this in person, I have, another box of specimens I have pinned up that again are just trying to highlight, this is probably not coming through great, but highlight it's a really diverse group. When we talk about the Hymenoptera, it's a lot of them do sting, a lot of them don't, but it is a fascinating group of insects to think about. Focusing in more closely to the stinging pests that we run into a lot when we're on customer accounts, we generally group them into two main families of insects stemming out from the Hymenoptera. That is the Vespids and the Apidae. The Vespids comprise what we traditionally think of as wasps, which is further broken down into our paper wasps, hornets, and yellow jackets. And then when we think about the Apidae or the bees, for the purposes of this talk, I just lumped all the bees, carpenter bees, honeybees, as well as bumblebees into one group as the bees. And I put this slide up again to answer that very obvious question I posed at the beginning of the talk, which is why do bees, wasps, and yellow jackets matter in pest management? Very simply, obviously, it's because they nest in and around structures, and many, if not all of them in these specific groups, are capable of delivering a sometimes very painful sting. And a simpler way of visualizing that tree for the purposes of identification is a pictorial representation that I have here. And what we can see very clearly is when we look at honeybees, we're talking primarily about the representative sample or taxa here as the European honeybee on the left-hand side. And then when we think about hornets in North America, the United States specifically, we're thinking about, as you may have guessed, the European hornet. And then when we think about wasps, the star of the show really for stinging insect control, we're thinking about yellow jackets on the top and then paper wasps on the bottom. Excuse me. To your customer from a 30,000 foot view, these all may look very similar. And very briefly, I'm going to talk about some simple ways to identify them, whether they're flying, whether they're sitting still, all in an aid to help you prepare for the treatment that you're about to do. When we look at bees, bees generally have a fairly uniform abdomen and thorax. They don't have that tightly constricted waist that's super visible to us, at least, compared to the wasps and hornets. They also typically have fairly robust legs, specifically compared to something like a paper wasp. and they're often very hairy. Their abdomen and thorax is really hairy, as well as their legs in many instances. And from an evolutionary perspective, this is probably because that hair helps them collect pollen that they need to feed to their brood back in their nest. When we think about wasps, we're thinking about, again, yellow jackets and paper wasps. They are substantially less hairy than any of our bees. They have this characteristic tightly constricted waist separating the thorax and abdomen. It's exaggerated even more so in paper wasps, as I'm sure you're familiar with. And wasps generally have longer, more spindly legs than any kind of honeybee or any kind of bee in general. And a quick way to distinguish between a yellow jacket and a paper wasp if they're flying is yellow jackets typically fly with their legs tucked up nice and neat next to their body, whereas paper wasps are going to be letting their legs dangle as they fly. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with this if you've seen these in the field at all. Hornets are obviously much more similar in morphology to what we would call a wasp more generally. They have that tightly constricted waist, and they're typically, however, a whole lot bigger than a yellow jacket or a paper wasp. Shown here again is the European hornet. It's one of the biggest hornets that's established in North America, I think over several hundred years ago, and so it's very prominent in the landscape. And again, it's much bigger than a lot of our other wasps, but most hornets typically also incorporate some type of darker coloration than most bees or wasps generally. European hornets have this characteristic reddish brown coloration on their body. And then the other hornet that you'll probably encounter a lot in North America, throughout North America, is the bald-faced hornet, which is strikingly black and white. And so, talking about identification wouldn't be complete without talking about very briefly some of the nesting habits that members from these different groups typically exhibit. And that's, again, really important to us when we think about these as structural pests, because many times we'll find them not only surrounding a primary residence, but they may unfortunately find their way and make their nests into internal structures, which can really complicate the problem for treatment, which we'll talk about more specifically toward the latter half of the talk. Starting with honeybees again, or bees in general, most bees are obligate cavity nesters. In the case of honeybees, that's certainly the case. And so in the landscape, they're going to take up residence primarily in tree holes, trees that have fallen over and hollowed out, as well as in stumps that result from some kind of deadfall. And they typically take up space. They take up nesting spaces in spaces or structures that give them room to expand. Honeybees are obviously prolific workers in the environment, and they're going to really seek out a space where they can expand their nest and grow their brood fairly quickly. Wasps are similar in behavior in the sense that they do also prefer some type of cavity to nest in. Oftentimes, this is in the soil. And because of that, we think of yellow jackets as being able to slightly better terraform their environment rather than honeybees, specifically if they're nesting in the soil. They won't necessarily dig a complete nest. They typically will try to make use of an old rodent burrow or some other root structure that's already kind of hollowed out the ground. But nonetheless, they will modify that area to some degree relative to the other species we're going to talk about. Paper wasps are where we really start to diverge in terms of nesting structures. They prefer to nest aerially almost exclusively, not in the ground. And they also form this characteristic umbrella-shaped nest that I'm sure you're all familiar with. Uh, it starts out small and gets bigger, no surprise there, but nonetheless, the shape takes about the same no matter what species you're dealing with and no matter what time of the year it is. Hornets do things a little bit differently, again, as I'm sure you're all aware. Your bald-faced hornets, as well as some other hornet species, make these characteristic spherical nest shapes. And really, that is formed by them comprising sheets of overlapping material, and then their actual brood or comb structure is interspersed between those layers, and that's where they, lay their eggs, develop their larvae, and eventually grow their nest. Now, in the case of European hornets, again, which are super common, what you're going to be dealing with most of the time, probably, they are again more of a cavity nester. And in many eastern and southern forests, they're super common, and they're going to be making their nest primarily in tree holes that where a limb's fallen off, or again, similar to a honeybee, where a stump is hollowed out or a tree's fallen over. And we'll talk more about the differences in this nesting habitat that hornets have and how to treat them again in the latter part of the talk. So we've covered a lot very briefly on identification, and I hope that was helpful. I think probably a lot of that was review, but I think it's not a talk on yellow jackets and wasps. It's not complete without that. But now I want to briefly talk about how we can conceptualize bees, wasps, other stinging insects in terms of their risk to our customers, which is something that obviously is kind of the main thing we're thinking about in pest management. And something that's been studied by hymenopterists that are studying social stinging insects very broadly is how does sociality relate to their aggression very generally? And this again has been explored for a long period of time, and it's pretty well thought out science. And the general consensus is that the more social a species of wasp or ant is, the more aggressive it is. And so, just with the few taxa that we've covered, I wanted to pose this question. This is not a quiz question, but just kind of a concept check. Is if we were to rank some of these groups that we've talked about based on their sociality, we'd come up with something probably like this. It's not exact, but we would say that honeybees are certainly the most social of the bees and wasps, and then we have something like yellow jackets, which are certainly social, but probably less so obligately social than honeybees, followed by paper wasps that have a wide range of sociality. Some of them get close to being solitary nesters. Few of them, but some do. And so if we were to rank these based on sociality, we would then also say that, honeybees are more aggressive than yellow jackets, which are more aggressive than paper wasps. And so the question is this something that, you would agree with, or, would you communicate this to your customer? Again, which is well thought out by science, but is this something you would communicate? And I think clearly it's kind of a rhetorical question. The answer is no, because as pest management professionals, we are obviously considering the context with which our customers are going to be interacting with these pests or where they're likely to encounter them. And so rather than thinking of who's aggressive and who's not, I like to think of this group of insects and their risks that present to our customers as who's hungry and who's not. I've highlighted yellow jackets here very intentionally because they are voracious scavengers, especially in the summer and early fall. And they almost always develop this concealed nest. And so when we think about these pest groups very broadly, these are a group of insects that are most likely to surprise our customers. And I know they've surprised me in many situations in urban areas, but also, if you're out for a hike or just out in the landscape more generally, running into yellow jackets is never fun. And so our customers probably already think this, but if not, it's an educational point to let them know that, your yellow jackets of all these groups are most likely to be your most intrusive and therefore the most nuisance pest. And again, these do carry with them some public health risk, particularly if you're someone who's allergic. So just really a little concept check there about how to think and communicate these stinging pests specifically to our customers. And so here is the actual first quiz question. So which group of stinging bees or wasps has a constricted waist, nests aerially, and generally exhibits low aggression? So feel free to reach out in the chat and type your answer. Okay, we're getting some activity, which is great. And yes, the correct answer is D, paper wasps. Generally, relatively low aggression, which is nice. Again, granted on where they, make their actual nest, it can be they can be intimidating. However, unless they're disturbed directly, they're unlikely to really bother you or get after you. And so I don't see no questions came through, but just before we move on to safety, PPE, and IPM, any questions more generally from the group about identification, behavior, some of the basics that we covered thus far? Just give this a couple seconds. Any questions in the chat? All right, moving on. Oh, we have a question. Yes. What about cicada killers? Really interesting group. I actually have one of them in my little box right here. If you can see, it's right there. Looks very similar to a European hornet, a common look-alike that we deal with a lot. They're quite different behaviorally and taxonomically than the yellow jackets or bees. And it's actually been something that has puzzled systematics and evolutionary biologists for a while. So we talked about sociality a lot. So again, this cooperation that many wasps and bees exhibit. Your cicada killers, they're actually a solitary wasp species generally. Again, that varies to some degree, but they are not a group of individuals that a group of specimens that do much in terms of social cooperation. It's good because that means they're generally not that aggressive. And I have some colleagues that I've seen personally actually handle cicada killers, big, huge female cicada killers. I've never done that before because their sting, they do have a huge stinger. It would certainly hurt. But they are a relatively low aggressive individual, and they're actually in their own family of wasps. So when we think about yellow jackets and paper wasps, we're thinking about the family Vespidae, but your cicada killers are actually in the family Craboranidae, and so they're so different, not only more behaviorally but also genetically, that they're in their own kind of outgroup of families. And so, yes, someone's putting in the chat that customers are very afraid of them. I certainly am too, in terms of I always want to see, is it actually a cicada killer? They're not that dangerous, and they do have the capacity to sting. Again, they have a big stinger, but generally they, based on their behavior and their genetics, they're not that aggressive, which is great for us. So awesome question. So again, we've covered a lot of information briefly about identification and behavior, and now we're going to move into another chunk of this material, which is safety, PPE, and IPM when we think about stinging insects. So again, as I mentioned, PPE may be even more important than it typically always is. But again, it is always important. But certainly when you're dealing with something that can sting you, it's of utmost importance. And when you're dealing with stinging insects, a bee suit is really a great place to start. And obviously try to get a high quality one that is made of a thicker material versus something, more Tyvek suit like. That's not going to stop a yellow jacket or really many stinging insects from stinging you. We often recommend our techs wear or either buy suits that come with gloves that have an extended cuff, or buy them separately, just because again it gives you an extra layer of protection if a specimen were to find its way underneath your sleeve. And then I chose this picture again very intentionally. You can see this guy is wearing tennis shoes. Obviously, everyone knows not to do that. I can see some bare skin here. That's not going to serve him very well if he gets into an angry nest of yellow jackets. So obviously, some type of boot is standard gear. And if you can find a bee suit with ankle guards, again, just like your extended cuff gloves, they're going to be kind of like the cream of the crop or the highest level of safety when it comes to a bee suit. Safety glasses obviously are generally important, but they're really important when you're dealing with paper wasps. You're almost always going to be looking up and you're going to be applying product up in the air. You're going to be having paper wasps falling from the sky as they get killed. And obviously, when you do nest removal, you're going to have bits of nesting material falling down. So safety glasses are huge for all of these pest groups, but definitely when you're dealing with paper wasps. Respiratory protection, again, always something that's good to have as a standard PPE piece of gear. But when you're doing inspections, especially in things like attics, crawl spaces, where you may have some of these nests taking place, hopefully not too many, but they will be there. Giving yourself some dust protection as well as some aerosol protection if you're making applications indoors is really key. And then obviously, if you have any suspected allergies to stinging pests, which a lot of people do, making sure you have an EpiPen that you know how to use as well as somebody else with you knows how to use is very important should you be stung. I think there's a pretty good argument to be made that, if you're highly allergic, maybe you shouldn't be the guy or gal that's out doing stinging insect pests, but sometimes, you have to do the job that's presented to you. So just, be aware if you are allergic to have your EpiPen and have someone around you that knows how to use it as well. Safety, obviously, you can have all the gear in the world, but obviously our behavior and how we interact with the pests really ultimately determines how safe we can be. One thing that's really important when you're dealing with particularly yellow jackets and hornets in general is to treat them at dawn or dusk. And that's because that's when you're most likely to have all of the workers or the majority of the workers back in the nest that you're going to treat. And that's really important, obviously, because if you're applying a dust or an aerosol into the nest, you want to kill as many individuals as you can, and therefore you want to try to have them there. Excuse me, there's many instances of, treatments gone awry during midday. Not all the workers are killed, and they can come back and salvage pieces of that nest or develop satellite nests nearby. And then again, you haven't really solved the problem. In some senses, you may have made it worse. So always try to do yellow jacket and hornet treatments at dawn and dusk. Paper wasps don't really matter when you treat those. Just like when using a chainsaw, you want to avoid using ladders whenever possible, especially if you have individuals that are coming out of the nest. You don't want to be on an elevated platform when you're trying to be safe. There's a variety of, I kind of highlighted that here on the slide. There's a variety of extendable bee poles that you can use, and they have a variety of attachments, including spray can attachments that can be great for any aerosol treatment that you're doing. We had a rep from JT Eaton come by with an extendable bee pole that goes to just about 30 feet. It might be 25 feet, but that's a long pole. I did maximally extend it, and it gets pretty heavy, but immediately I saw the value in terms of you can reach a lot of rooftops with that long pole. And then obviously, just like any other treatment you're doing, advise your customers to stay inside, particularly if you think there's going to be stinging pests flying about before, during, or after your treatment. And so we covered some PPE and some safety. I just wanted to briefly talk about, again, what we're thinking about in terms of this pest group, but maybe even most of our pest groups in particular. We're trying to reduce the number of encounters that are negative with stinging insects that our customers have to experience. And so that really slots nicely into a broader IPM program. And there are many non-chemical interventions that we can do and we can recommend to our customers as a preventative means of reducing the negative interactions they're going to have with stinging insects more generally. This will look very similar to any kind of strategy that we're talking about with fill flies or even mosquitoes in some situations. There are cultural practices that can be very effective. Obviously, keeping screens that are tight fitting on doors and windows can keep these pests out of your house. Clean trash receptacles are very important for a variety of pests, namely yellow jackets. And then obviously sealing gaps, holes, and cracks, crevices in external structures, external walls, garages can be very helpful for preventing pests from getting into structures. And then one of the great things about stinging pest management, there's pest management for stinging pests in general, is that really nest removal is kind of what you're shooting for, and that is really giving you an opportunity to get at a truly elimination perspective, which is not the case for many pests. And so that slots nicely into a broader IPM program or a broader IPM concept, where you're actually treating the source of the problem, not just symptom management. And so before we get into the actual meat of the talk, which is talking about treatments, again, I just want to emphasize again the importance of doing a thorough inspection, not just when you have a known stinging insect problem, but I put this picture on the bottom here, which is as I mentioned earlier, a small paper wasp nest turning into a very large paper wasp nest. And the idea here is that if you can identify these early season nests, you obviously can prevent them from getting and turning into these larger nests. And so thorough inspection just gives you a better chance to actually treat problems effectively, makes your job easier, probably makes your job more profitable as well. Customers may often inform you of stinging insect problems they're having. I think this individual that has these wasps in their folding umbrella probably knows they're there, but they may not. And if you can be the one to solve that problem for them, or at least identify it, it's going to give you a lot of credibility, and again, help build that trust that is, key to a healthy working relationship. And again, as I mentioned before, always be prepared for attic inspections and those in hard to reach areas, because again, these guys can get in a lot of places that you might not be typically looking for infestations. And the last thing I'll say before we really get into, there's another quiz question, but before we get into the actual treatments, is what do we do about honeybees? We tell our guys, and I think this is good advice, is just don't attempt to remove honeybees without the consultation of an apiarist. Obviously, occasionally honeybees will merit destruction in certain instances. Nest removal is typically what is preferred. And again, always consult with an apiarist before you try to do this, as well as talk to your customer about what the problem they actually have is. Honeybees can, they can look really crazy when they're in walls or in under floorboards like this, but oftentimes, they have an entry and exit point to the outdoors. So, you don't necessarily always have to be the most aggressive with this pest species. And you can take your time with these in some instances. The Texas A&M AgriLife sponsors the Texas Apiarist Inspection Service, and I put a link to that on the slide. You can also just Google that. They have a ton of resources available, primarily targeting, I believe, pest management professionals. They have some best practices as well as an actual list of apiarists that are for hire, for contract, for retainer, that work with pest management professionals often for nest removals. So we've got a lot of questions, which is great. So we're going to hit this quiz question first, and then I'll address some of these questions before we get into really the meat of the talk and really the last part of this. So this quiz question, which pieces of PPE are essential when performing treatments for stinging insects? Hopefully this is a pretty easy one. Somebody put all the above. I won't wait any longer because that is the correct answer. And obviously what you actually wear depends on what pest you're treating, but I think a bee suit's always a great place to start. And if you have it, why not wear it? We had some questions come through, which I'm going to take real quick, if that's all right. Someone asked, what about Africanized bees? Yeah, so Africanized bees refers to Africanized honeybees, which is a real problem in the apiarist community as well as the agricultural community. Basically, honeybees have evolved in a lot of different places, and some of them have invaded into South America, I think originally, which is really the Africanized variant of the same species of honeybee. But it again, it's just much more aggressive than your honeybee that has evolved in Europe and then subsequently co-evolved in North America. And so, yeah, they are much more aggressive. Again, not necessarily something that doesn't really change the perspective that I think we should have when we're talking about honeybees. But just be wary that there are variants of honeybees out there. But again, we don't want to be killing honeybees. And as you are well aware, most of the labels for on almost all pyrethroid products that you're going to be using primarily are going to have some type of statement about not using these products against honeybees. Someone asked a question about whether aerosols or dusts are preferred. We're going to cover that in detail in just a minute. Someone said, mentioned nest removal, but what happens when bees swarm inadvertently and you don't see any nests? Yeah, that certainly can be an issue. Obviously, I would suspect that there's probably a nest somewhere in the area that could be used as a clue. If you're doing a perimeter inspection outside and you see swarming bees, particularly honeybees that are known to produce swarms before they nest or during active nesting, it might be a good idea to look where they're swarming, look for entry points, and that may give you some clues that maybe these bees are in an exterior wall, or maybe they are in the attic space. So again, I'd like to think of trying to utilize the behavior of the pest to give you clues about what might be going on. Okay, so without further ado, we're going to jump into the actual how do you treat these stinging pests, and these treatments vary considerably depending on what group of pests you're dealing with. For the purposes of this talk, I have this broken down into treatments for paper wasps, treatments for hornets, and then finally treatments for yellow jackets, where I feel like there's some new stuff on the horizon. Paper wasps, and I think these also go in order of complexity or challenge. Paper wasps are pretty easy, relatively speaking. Nest elimination is the goal here. And again, I highlighted that safety glasses are key because, again, you're going to be looking up a lot for these treatments. The products you're going to be using are, again, mostly pyrethroid based, things like PT Wasp Freeze, Onslaught Power Shot. I highlighted these two in particular because they comprise different formulations. They work very similarly, but one is petroleum based and one is water based. And this may be a consideration for you if you're spraying against siding or against windows or someplace where you don't want to have to deal with residue, although some of the newer petroleum-based products still aren't that bad. Just it gives you an option depending on where you're doing a treatment. And your petroleum products are going to stick a little bit better, obviously, because they're petroleum-based, but these water-based products also work extremely well. To do these treatments, this picture I grabbed here is a great example of really kind of like a textbook way of treating paper wasps. This gentleman is standing at about a 45-degree angle. Obviously, that's not always the case, but you do want to stand at some angle, not just right underneath the nest you're treating for obvious reasons. And you want to give yourself some distance. Most of these sprays, these aerosolized sprays, are going to get at least 10, 15 feet. So there's no need to get closer than that. Use the distance that you have to your advantage. And then obviously applying a liberal spray to the nest is what you want to target. Some people recommend a quicker spray to get that immediate knockdown, followed by a longer spray that really soaks the entire nesting area. I think that depends on how big the nest is. If it's a small nest, I think one good shot can be good enough. But obviously, if it's a larger nest and you want to minimize your risk, you can do, a short, 2 to 3 second, 5-second spray that will probably kill most of the paper wasps on the nest, but then it gives you a chance to back up, let that product work. You can then reapproach and get any of the stragglers that are still hanging onto the nest. Before moving on, I also want to highlight again this use of a bee pole with a spray can attachment. This can be a great addition to your kit that can make your job a lot easier. It allows you to get closer without actually physically getting closer. But I also do want to highlight this picture, again, chosen intentionally. We can see, well, this guy is doing kind of like the textbook case of treatment. This individual is not doing that. We can see we have open-toed shoes. We don't have an ounce of PPE anywhere on her body, and I would reckon she's also probably standing a little bit too close to where that spray aerosol is going to drip. So definitely don't be that person. Is a small droplet of an aerosolized insecticide in your eye going to cause you to go blind? Hopefully not. It can, but it's certainly going to ruin your day at the very least. So again, always put your safety glasses on and always just be safe when dealing with stinging pests. After you've thoroughly soaked down that nest, getting the nest out of there is your next strategy. This is fairly easy, especially if you have a bee pole with a duster head or a paint scraper. You can just knock that nest down. Be careful to do so safely if you're working near windows, which is often where some of these nests are on soffits and eaves. And then obviously after you have the nest knocked down, you want to use gloves to gather all the nests you knock down and remove them from the property. And I say obviously wear gloves because again, at that point, you're going to be dealing with a insecticide soaked nest, and you don't want to obviously have any points of contact or routes of ingestion with that exposure risk. So from here on out, someone asked a question about aerosol products versus dusts. For paper wasps, aerosols are kind of your first line of defense, probably what you're going to be using most often. But for hornets and yellow jackets, dusts are where they really come into their own and are going to be your first line of defense. And if we think about, again, we talked briefly about nesting habits. That's because hornets and yellow jackets are going to be in a confined nest space that's either the nest itself or a void. And so your dust is going to have the best chance of working and interacting and contacting all individuals in that confined space. Certainly for hornets and yellow jackets, a bee suit is going to be mandatory. And again, timing your treatments at dawn or dusk to ensure that you have high nest occupancy is going to be key. Delta dust or Tempo 1% dust is what we recommend our techs use. Again, both containing dust pyrethroid in formulation. And to treat hornets, you're going to want to start your application, as you might assume, at the entrance of the nest and then work your way back into the structure. If you're dealing with something like bald-faced hornets that have that spherical nest structure, it can be a good idea once you get a fair bit of product into the nest entrance. You can actually pierce the side of the nest with the nozzle tip and start applying dust directly into the nest structure itself. European hornets are a little bit different because again, they're probably going to be in some type of cavity and less exposed than a bald-faced hornet. And there's some images here of finding a European hornet nest in a tree hole, or finding them in this looks like conduit entrance to this house. You can obviously again start with your dust, applying it directly into their entrance hole. But if the space permits it, because again they have this confined nesting space, it can be useful to equip yourself with some plastic wrap or a bag that you put over the actual entrance hole. And then that's going to prevent, in theory, a lot of the hornets from coming out of the nest. And you can get your nozzle tip underneath the plastic and really hammer them with the dust product to get a really great application. Bulb applicators work really well depending on the size of the nest, but Exacticide makes a really cool battery-powered duster that we recommend to anyone because, again, it just gets a lot of product out there very quickly. Again, I mentioned it's battery-powered, so no pumping required, but obviously make sure that everything is charged up before you start a treatment if you're going with the Exacticide duster route. Nest removal is obviously, again, as I talked about, the name of the game for all of these pests. Um, Similar to paper wasps for hornets, especially if we're talking about bald-faced hornets that make this exposed nest. Knocking it down after you're sure that your treatment has been effective is fairly easy with a bee pole and attachments. If you're dealing with something like European hornets, where you actually have to get product back into a void, you obviously might not be able to remove the nest. It's still a good idea if you can, and the customer is okay with that. But at the very least, you're going to want to make sure that you use caulking or other exclusion material to seal up that entrance point where they were coming in the first place to prevent, again, a secondary pest infestation. And so now we're going to get to what I think is the star of the show, which is the Yellowjackets. And again, I think generally these can be some of the more challenging stinging insects to deal with, just because occasionally their nests can get very, very big, much bigger than most hornet or paper wasp nests, certainly. Um, Typically, these nests are perennial, meaning they go through periods of high growth and high worker numbers, and then periods of low worker numbers. But in places like Texas, Florida, and other areas of the South, that's not always the case. The southern yellow jacket can exist as a species year round. And so those nests can get very, very, very large. And so I think that inherently makes them more challenging, coupled with the fact that lots of times their nests are in very concealed locations. And because of that, because there may be hundreds, if not thousands, of workers in any individual nest, anything you can do before you actually start an insecticide treatment to reduce the number of workers in that nest basically is going to make your insecticide application more efficient, because you're going to have to use less insecticide, or sorry, the same amount of insecticide over fewer individuals. And so something that we're starting to recommend our technicians do, if they're comfortable with it, is using a vacuum to physically evacuate the nest before they start insecticide treatments with dust. I'm going to go through an example on an account that I was helping out at a few weeks ago, but I just want to go over some of the primers of how to set up your vacuum. You're going to want to use a vacuum that's at least 5 gallons or bigger, and is rated for working with wet water solutions. So your wet vac rating on there, and you're going to want to fill that vacuum with a few inches of water. And then we also recommend putting in dish soap, at least, a few drops probably would do it, but a teaspoon or a tablespoon to a couple inches of water is fine as well. And what that's going to do is prevent the wasps from just climbing out of the water using surface tension and their other yellow jacket bodies. It's gonna allow them to drown effectively in the vacuum. And then obviously you want to prepare the products that you're using after the vacuum before you start the vacuum. Because we're using dusts, it's great to just get everything set out and loaded in your duster before you start the vacuum up, because then you can just go seamlessly from the vacuum, keep the vacuum running even in some situations while you apply your dust. And again, it's important to look for secondary tunnels or other entry points. I put this picture up here because this is like your idealized ground nesting yellow jacket that only has one entrance. And that's typically the case, but sometimes there might be multiple routes that they could use, especially if they're agitated. And so before you fire up your vacuum and get them agitated, you want to make sure that you have the primary hole that you think they're going to come out of identified, and the other holes either sealed up or treated already. And so I'm just going to jump into what this looks like in the field. So I went out with a service manager a few weeks ago to a southern yellow jacket infestation that was in a kind of patio entertainment area. It was near a fireplace. Because of where it was at, we couldn't actually get nest removal, which was unfortunate, but it being in the outdoor environment made that a little bit more palatable. So this is Conley, a service manager here for one of the Dallas branches. He's filling up his shop vac here, and he does have a 5 gallon shop vac. So I think that's kind of like the minimum size that I would recommend anyways. From there, he's approaching, bee suit on, He has his veil down and zipped up. We double, triple checked all that for each other, which is a good practice as well. And starting the evacuation, and you can get a sense if you have the right entry hole when you approach with the vacuum, because they're going to know what's going on pretty quickly when the vacuum fires up. And so if you know there's a nest in there, or you're reasonably sure, and you don't see yellow jackets coming out, you probably have the wrong entrance hole. But again, I would stress that trying to identify that before you start to vacuum up is going to give you the best outcome. And then you want to let that vacuum run for a while. So we were fortunate that we had this fireplace right here, but there's a lot of ways to rig up the vacuum. You can even carry something with you if you'd like, some sandbags, a small tripod, monopod, whatever, just to let that vacuum run where you can back away and let that thing evacuate as many yellow jackets as possible. And you really want to keep an eye on it though. You don't want to walk away completely. A, it may fall, but B, at some point you're gonna have to get in there with your treatment, with your insecticide and treat the nest. So once in this nest, we saw a lot of yellow jackets come out immediately, and then that slowly trickles down into, one per minute, one per 30 seconds. And at that point, you probably have most of your yellow jackets, or at least a large proportion of your yellow jackets out of that nest and in your vacuum. And so that's kind of when you say, okay, turn the vacuum off and let's get in there with some dust and really do the treatment. As I mentioned, starting with hornets, dust formulated products are going to be your first line of defense for yellow jackets and hornets, particularly. You obviously want to use enough dust and enough air pressure to get dust throughout the entire nest as well as the nest void. Be liberal with this stuff because, again, sometimes you may be trying to get it down a couple feet into the actual nest material. It does thankfully float around pretty well in the nest void, but again, just make sure that you get an even application with enough dust. We do recommend as well the use of some aerosolized insecticides. Many of them are not likely to give you the degree of knockdown or efficacy or kill that you're going to get with a dust. But as I'll talk about in a moment, certain products that contain just pyrethrins, things like pie, can be very useful when combined with a dust formulation to, again, get the yellow jackets that are in that void agitated and moving through your dust material, again, just enhancing the efficacy of the dust that you've used. And that's actually what we did on this account that I talked about previously. You can see Conley here just using a hand duster, but again, it wasn't a huge nest, and we kind of confirmed that visually beforehand. But getting a fair amount of dust into the nest void. You can see the vacuum's right there. It's turned off at this point, but again, if things don't go according to plan and you need to make a evacuation or take a break, kick that vacuum back on and keep sucking up individuals while you're not actually treating them. But again, put enough dust in there to get an even application. For purposes of demonstration, we were being a little bit more slow with this treatment, as you might imagine. And so this is a yellow jacket worker that we grabbed. You can see its face is covered in dust as well as some of its thorax as well. And so you'll see them flailing around on the ground covered in dust. And again, it's great to see that your product is working like that. But what we did with this is also follow up, as I mentioned, before we used the pie, and this is just your standard PT pie, Conley put a short burst of more dust into the nest void, again, likely using a little bit more air pressure, getting that dust to hopefully be suspended in the nesting area, and then he gave it a short blast with some pyrethrins, again, in theory, to get them agitated. Not that they weren't already, but again, just to encourage them to get through that dust and let that dust do its job. One thing I just saw my note here, but one thing you often see, and we did see with this nest, which was really interesting, is that at a certain point in the treatment, the queen, who again is responsible for laying all the eggs and kind of is obviously the core of that nest. At a certain point, she kind of calls it quits and gets the heck out of there. And we actually were able to catch her, and we did see probably about 2/3 of the way through the treatment, especially after the use of the pie. The queen, again, being triple the size of your typical worker, she came bailing out of the nest, and it's a good sign that your treatment's working. If she's ready to, give up, all that she's built, that you're getting some good efficacy. So be on the lookout. And I think it's just kind of an interesting biology perspective that, you can kind of use again that behavior that I talked about to inform how well your treatment's going or where you need to be doing a better job. Nest removal, as I mentioned again, is always the gold standard when we're talking about stinging pests. You want to make sure with yellow jackets in particular, you're giving your treatment time to work. It's often recommended to just schedule a return visit when you know you're doing a yellow jacket treatment. It not only allows you again to confirm that you did get nest elimination. The worst thing that could happen is you start to try to evacuate the nest and it's not actually completely killed. The workers aren't killed, and then you have a whole different kind of problem on your hands. So giving yourself some time is good for a variety of reasons. And obviously, if it's practical, you want to try to remove that nest. If they're in the ground or underneath secondary structures in the environment, that can be pretty easy to do relative to removal in an exterior wall or attic space. If you do need to go that route, obviously make sure everything is good to go with your customer before you start, opening up their walls. Once you locate the nest, it can be relatively efficient to do nest removal, and it is beneficial with yellow jackets again because I mentioned they get to some pretty large sizes. And if you do a successful job of colony elimination, you're going to have a lot of dead yellow jackets rotting in a wall, and that's going to smell terrible for up to weeks. And as well, it's going to set you up for secondary pest infestation with flies in particular coming to those dead yellow jacket corpses. So removal's an awesome strategy, an awesome option if you can get it done, but obviously that depends on where the nest is at. If you can't, filling or sealing the potential entry points is the name of the game, similar to hornets. In the example I mentioned earlier, we used some excluder mesh rodent barrier to fill up the cracks in the bricks where we thought the yellow jackets were accessing that nest. And what differs from yellow jackets from the other pests is that we're seeing, the emergence of attractive traps that kill yellow jackets to be evolving strategy that can be effective. Again, just like other pests, I'm thinking of mosquitoes in particular. You can't always treat the nest if it's not on your customer's account, or you might actually have, something that's super attractive in your customer's account that they can't take care of. That is bringing those yellow jackets in. And if you want to try to keep them away from a certain area, one thing that's slightly possible or potentially possible is luring them away from whatever they're attracted to in the environment with the use of traps. Again, you're not going to get elimination with this strategy, but it's really about reducing the number of workers that are present in the environment, and again, reducing that possibility of negative interactions with your customers. These come in a variety of shapes and sizes from a variety of manufacturers. I've shown a couple of the ones that we really like up here. But what's important to all of these strategies, if you use traps, is that maintenance is absolutely key, especially in places like Texas where it gets hot, because most of all these traps require water to be present in the actual trap. That not only makes killing the yellow jackets via drowning possible, but it also keeps the bait that is critical to these traps performing able to be emitted from the trap as a vapor. And so you want to make sure that whatever you do with traps, you're able to get back to them within some reasonable interval, especially in the summer months. As I talked about very briefly, attractants are really necessary for yellow jacket trapping. And why I think it's fascinating and why it's a growing area is that we're identifying new attractants that can be used as bait in traps. The ones that currently exist right now vary widely. Many of them are marking pheromones, some of them are food lures, and these do also vary by the region that you're in. Rescue, for example, explicitly sells their traps as being attractive to yellow jackets in the east or yellow jackets in the west. That doesn't necessarily always help us in the south or southeast, but we found that the eastern variant of the lure 2-methylbutanol is very effective for southern yellow jackets as well. But again, the lure is key. We find the ones that work the absolute best across regions, which is great for uniformity and for bulk purchasing for our company, is ones that combine pheromones with a food-based lure. And those kind of work more generally against all yellow jackets. Timing is really key. There's some evidence to suggest that getting your traps out early in the year can be effective at trapping queens that are emerging from their overwintering sites. They're going to be the ones that are establishing the nests that grow into larger nests throughout the year. So if able, if possible, you get these traps out early, you can capture some of the queens that are in the landscape. Again, you're not going to eliminate them, but this is all about reduction of yellow jackets in the environment. And then, obviously getting these out in the summer and maintaining them through the late summer, early fall in Texas, at least until Halloween, maybe even Thanksgiving, um, uh, to get again the bulk of the workers as the nest grows and comes to maturity in the latter part of the season. Finally, some things that are also coming on the scene for yellow jackets are attract and kill baits. I did a little bit of poking around more broadly on the internet, looking at some of these bait recipes. There are a lot of do-it-yourself options. I went on Reddit and found this subreddit called Wasp Hating, um, which had some interesting thoughts, some of which was good. But as I scrolled down through the comments, one thing I did note is that many commenters were recommending the off-label use of toxicants with baits such as tuna, other fish-derived substances. And so proceed with caution there. You obviously don't want to do anything off-label with a toxicant or a pesticide and a homemade solution. And so really, I think, we need to let the chemical companies and the industry themselves work out the safest way to do attract and kill baits. Um, we technically have the active ingredients, things like fipronil, dinotefuran, that would be great in a bait, and they are great AIs in baits. But when we think about what yellow jackets forage on, which is protein and sugar, that's very general to a lot of bees and wasps in the landscape. And so really, I think we need to do a lot more work on the actual focus on the dispensers that yellow jackets might access this bait by. Again, the worst case scenario is we develop a good bait, but it attracts honeybees. That would be obviously something to avoid. But nonetheless, I think it's something that many parties are interested in, and I think stay tuned for new developments with baits in particular. And so, I have a short video to talk about just to emphasize how voracious yellow jackets can be. We had someone come in and demo a scope for us, and I happened to have some yellow jackets in the lab. But I thought this was a really cool shot that we were able to grab. Seeing the mandibles chomping is fairly scary, but they are voracious scavengers. And so, yeah, thank you all for your attention. And yeah, I have some questions that are in the chat that I can start to answer, but I think we'll go off mute here pretty soon. And yeah, thank you all.
Let's see. All right, so I'm going to unmute you as we
Josiah, that was
go.
awesome. Very, very interesting, and not always fun to deal with, but paper wasp amaze me the way they peel off little bits of wood, and like I'll just sit there and watch them work. So we have a question about carpenter bees.
Yeah. Carpenter bees, the question is, where would these fit into this kind of concept of, uh, I guess, pest management for stinging insects? Again, not much of a threat in terms of carpenter bees stinging you, but certainly very destructive. A few years ago, we were looking at a new excluder mesh that a small company developed, I believe, somewhere in the southeast, but it was basically like a thimble that you would put in the entrance hole of the carpenter bee to basically trap them in the wood or in the gallery they were producing. But the guy that started this company actually obviously had an interest in carpenter bees. He brought us. I should have that here. I don't, but he brought us a kind of like a cross section of a board from his shed that showed the galleries in a piece of wood that he had collected. And from a damage perspective, I mean, I'd say probably 20 to 25% of this um, uh, 4x2 was removed internally. So they're very destructive. And I know there are a variety of traps that are out on the market. I'm not super familiar with them, but I've heard they can work good, or they can be efficacious. But I think that obviously using caulking when they're in their nest can be useful. If you can ensure that they can't get out, they will eventually starve and die in that gallery. But obviously they can tunnel their way out as well, so it is a little challenging. But I think I need to look up what that company was, but they developed this really cool little mesh thimble that you'd put in the hole that they had dug, which was interesting, I thought.
Hey, Travis has a question. I'm gonna Travis, if you'll unmute, then you can ask your question if he's there. Travis, are you
Travis has
there?
had his hand up for a while. I'm worried his arm went to sleep.
I know. Did he pass out on us? I don't know. Oh well.
Good morning,
So
Dr. Bob.
Good morning.
Yeah,
How's
it's
everybody doing today?
fantastic.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much for that presentation. When I went up to the center to visit everybody, I didn't see you up there. I missed seeing you when I was there, so doggone it. I'll have to come up and see you. I work for BSF, and couple things. Psychic CS has on the label you can mix into like a tuna or chicken base and use that for a tract and kill bait. So there's a couple dilutables out there that have that on there. But I agree, there's potential for some other ones that could be really, really strong on that too.
Mhm.
But yeah, just wanted to throw that in. So, and I'll mention one other thing too. Carpenter bees with the damage, like you were talking about, fantastic biology about them. But we added carpenter bees to the Terminator SC label a few years back, and that's been a really nice opportunity for doing localized treatments and stopping that damage.
Nice.
Yeah,
Cool. Thank you.
Jane,
Josiah,
did you
thank you
get all
so
your
much, man.
questions answered?
Still a little bit of, can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Mhm.
Okay, still a little bit of question about the carpenter bees.
Mhm.
Obviously, I've had some work with them before, but you mentioned not getting up close to wherever they avoid ladders is basically what it is. But to me, this is something that you have to get up on a ladder to be able to do something with the galleries, to be able to plug it up with the mesh that you're mentioning, or either, whatever, and spraying something into the gallery. So will the handle long treatment handle, will that, suffice for that type of treatment?
Depending on where they're at, it's certainly context specific. And yeah, you're never gonna eliminate the need for a ladder necessarily, but avoiding them if you can. Fortunately, if you're just dealing with carpenter bees in particular, and you don't have a secret paper wasp nest also hanging out near that gallery or near that entrance hole, they're not certainly as aggressive as something like a Yellowjacket or a Hornet. So
Mhm.
again, you do mitigate some risk there. I don't think you're likely to get swarmed by a group of carpenter bees. It certainly isn't,
Gossip.
yeah, isn't impossible, but for them in particular, I think you could probably be certainly a little bit more safe on a ladder than
Mhm.
approaching a Yellowjacket or paper wasp nest that was aerially presented.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, the other question, can I ask it?
Yes, ma'am, please.
Okay, the other question, I mentioned to you something about bees and swarming, and you said to look for the nest. Well, just happens that these particular bees were swarming onto a ladder, and the ladder was at the airport. And if you're all familiar with the ramps at airports, there's a million places that they could be. So, what would you suggest on something like that? Just to let them pass
Uh,
by because they did leave.
yeah, it certainly depends on what they are. Obviously, if they're honeybees, which in the spring and in certain times of the year, even if they're just moving their nest, they certainly will swarm in a variety of places. It's not uncommon to see that necessarily.
Mhm.
But if they are honeybees, I think your best bet is just to let them avoid the area if you can and let them figure out what they're doing. If they're on an airport ladder, I'd say it's unlikely that they're going to start building a nest there in particular. But if it's something like a congregation of yellow jackets or other things that are a little bit less sensitive, an aerosolized
They
spot
stopped in,
treatment.
they stopped in over the weekend and then they left. They
Yeah,
weren't there on Monday. So that was it on that. Right. One other question, and then I'm through. Is that okay?
Yes,
yeah.
ma'am.
Okay. The last question that I have is about the yellow jackets, that have a nest in the soil. Now, is it actually the fumes from the lawnmower that irritates them, or is it the vibration that irritates them and gets them to moving around?
Certainly could be a combination of both, but I would bet the vibration and the sound in general is what's going to really trigger them. Certainly, if
Mhm.
you park your lawnmower over top of ground nesting yellow jacket, it's going to make some suction as well, which is similar to the vacuum. When we do vacuum treatments, they definitely know what's going on, and they're like, "We're coming out right now." So probably a combination of all of those things. I bet vibration more than anything else is what they're cueing in, why are the walls shaking type of response.
Hmm. Well, you know what? I've learned over the years that people, whenever they call me, they'll say, well, I have bees. Well, they don't necessarily have bees all the time. So identification is very important. That's my last comment.
Absolutely. I
Thank you,
completely
Karen.
agree. Yep.
I'm done.
You have a happy holiday. Cody, do you have a question? He had a question in the chat. I didn't know if you had got to it. Is there anything we can do with all the wasp or who are entering homes now with all the weather changes?
Yeah, definitely that emphasizes that point, that kind of more general IPM strategy that we talked about in terms of, exclusion being, super important. Looking at, any entrances into your attic, any entrances in exterior walls, places where anywhere they can find their way in really is even, it's just good to tell your homeowner to do that as well. Not necessarily even us as pest management professionals. They can get out and do a lot of this stuff in terms of exclusion themselves very easily, very cheaply. A tube of caulking and a screwdriver checking screens for tight fitment can be very helpful. But yeah, I would certainly um, recommend just thorough property inspection. Go in your garage, look for any place they can find their way in to try to overwinter.
All right. Does anyone else have any questions? If so, speak now or forever hold your peace.
One way to put it.
Forever? My gosh.
Well, forever today.
Thank
There's
you
a-
very
there's a-
much. Thank you very much.
All right, everyone, thank you so much for being a part of it. I hope you all have a happy Thanksgiving, and we will see you in December.
All right. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.